Good morning and good yontif.
Good morning and good yontif.
A few years back, this story appeared on the pages of the Journal-Constitution. And this true story read, Gary Clark and Stephen Barbin met decades ago and became close friends. So close that Clark was the best man at Barbin's wedding, and that he had even once signed a photograph to him, "You are truly like a brother." But how truly like a brother, they had no way of knowing. That year, when Gary Clark was contacted by the adoption agency looking for related siblings, he was surprised because his adoptive parents had never told him that he had been adopted. When he found out that he'd been adopted, he told the social worker on the phone that he was going to turn to his best friend for support because he knew that his best friend had been adopted. He surmised that his friend would be able to help him figure out these new feelings that he now had. "So who's your best friend?" the director of the adoption agency asked him on the phone. "Well, his name is Steve Barbin," Clark responded. And then there was a long pause from the other end of the phone line. You see, Barbin and Clark, unwitting brothers, but extremely close friends, finally discovered that the brother that they had always wanted, always needed, was actually right there, in front of their very own eyes. And then, at the Jewish holidays a few years ago, Barbin, Clark, and 3 other siblings that they never really knew about, they finally met. Story doesn't end there, though. A few months after that, a Connecticut man contacted state officials seeking information from his adoption file for medical reasons. And that man discovered that he was one of 9 children from a single family whose parents had given them up for adoption. 5 of the children had been raised as Jews. 4 of the siblings had grown up in Christian homes. And none of them had seen each other since infancy or early childhood. You know, thinking about it, recognizing who your long-lost brother is, well, the entire book of Genesis is just one long footnote on the subject of learning to recognize our duties and our responsibilities to the people who are our brothers and sisters. You see, from a spiritual point of view, the Torah reminds us that we all come into this world blind. As infants, our eyes cannot yet focus. So the Bible begins in Genesis chapter 4, and that chapter uses the word brother just 7 times. It's a mystical reminder that just as 7 days makes one whole week, knowing who one's brother is makes one a whole person. The book of Genesis chapter 4 speaks to us of our own blindness. And so the story that I'm about to tell you, by the way, is displayed there in the closest window that goes next to Blake. It tells the story. That's Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. The Bible says Cain talked with Abel, his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and he slew him. And the Lord said to Cain, "Cain, do you know where Abel, your brother, is?" And the best that Cain can reply is, "I don't know where my brother is. Am I my brother's keeper?" So this is the primary story of the book of Genesis, and it's our story as well. We ignore our brother. We eschew each other. We avoid the need to discover our face in the face of the other until at last we uncover that the blood boiling up out of the ground is none other than the blood of our very own brother. The biblical scene in Genesis asks a question which is too inarticulate to speak and too uncomfortable to hear. When God says to Cain, "Do you know where your brother is?" And Cain glibly responds, "I don't know. Was I supposed to watch him? Am I my brother's keeper?" It is, of course, it's a question that has no answer, because it's not actually a question. It is, in fact, it's a moral imperative. Am I my brother's keeper? Do you know where your brother is? A person could argue that the entire book of Genesis begins and ends with just that one question. Do we recognize who our brother is? Now, there's another famous story all the way at the end of Genesis. Genesis comes to its dramatic conclusion when the 11 children of Jacob are standing in front of their long-lost brother, Joseph, and his amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. The Dreamcoat must be distracting them, because they don't even know that their brother is the person standing in front of them. The Bible says that they do not recognize their very own brother standing in front of them. Joseph, whom they sold into slavery. Joseph, their very own flesh and blood. Joseph, whom they do not know. Or perhaps the point of the scene is they don't want to know him. They don't want to recognize him. And so listen now how the story ends in Genesis, with Joseph ever gently reminding his brothers of who he really is. Genesis chapter 45 says, Joseph could not refrain before all who stood before him. And Joseph began to weep. And Joseph said to his brothers, I'm Joseph, your long-lost brother, whom you sold into slavery. Knowing who your brother is, Cain standing by the blood of Abel, Isaac mistaking Jacob for Esau, Judah and Simeon unable to see that Joseph, their very own brother, is right before their eyes. My friends, knowing where our brother is knowing that the other guy is our brother, that the other woman across from us is our sister. Now, Dr. King knew these things. He knew them as surely as he knew the back of his hand or the sight of his own face. Like St. Paul writing from his prison cell, Dr. King wrote, I have watched churches stand on the sideline and merely mouth pious irrelevancies and sanctimonious trivialities in the midst of the mighty struggle to rid our nation of racial and economic injustice. I have heard, said Dr. King, so many ministers say the Bible does not really comment on social issues. They are not our concern. So here we are, wrote Dr. King, with a religious community largely adjusted to the status quo, standing as a tail light behind other community agencies rather than a headlight leading men and women to higher levels of justice. Do we know who our brother is? Dr. King wrote that if America is to remain a first-class nation, it cannot have second-class citizens. Do we know where our brother is? As much as I love the literary aspects of the book of Genesis, there comes a time when the Bible has to come alive, right? When you're supposed to put into practice what the Bible says, not just nebulous promises and sentiments. And so now I want to tell you the story of the movement which is called the Family Promise. In 1981, Karen Olson was a marketing executive who developed promotional campaigns for consumer products. One morning on her way to a meeting, she saw a homeless woman, someone she'd seen over and over again on her way to work. She decided to buy a sandwich for the woman. The stranger accepted the sandwich, but asked for something else. A moment to be heard, to be comforted, and to be considered as more than a mere statistic on a cold street corner. Soon, Karen and her 2 young sons began frequent trips to New York to hand out sandwiches to the homeless. As she came to know some of the city's homeless people, she began to understand the profound loss and disconnection that homelessness causes. That understanding for Karen and her children turned into an enduring commitment. Olson learned that there were hundreds of homeless people, including families, in her home community of Union County, New Jersey. She turned to the religious community for help, convinced that there were many who shared her concern and that together they could do what they could not do alone. Within 10 months, 11 area congregations came forward to provide hospitality space within their very own buildings. The local YMCA agreed to provide showers and a daycare center for families. On October the 27th, 20 years ago, 1987, the very first interfaith hospitality network opened up its doors. It's now called the Family Promise. It has established 185 affiliates in 42 states, using the services of more than 160,000 volunteers and 6,000 congregations. When you become a Family Promise congregation, you provide shelter, meals, housing, job placement, supporting more than 53,000 homeless family members, 60% of them children, witnessing the firsthand the obstacles that low-income families face. Family Promise leaders and volunteers have been motivated to do more. Family Promise congregations have seized the initiative to create additional community programs, such as housing renovation, job training, healthcare programs, as a way of helping at-risk families avoid homelessness. Family Promise began training volunteers to advise and to mentor families, helping them achieve and maintain self-sufficiency. And although more than 40 states and 150,000 volunteers now define the breadth and the depth of the organization, Karen's mandate remains in place. If you can strengthen one family, then you can strengthen a nation. Now, there are dozens of Christian congregations that do house homeless families here in Cobb. Dozens of Christian congregations. There are 4 Jewish congregations in Cobb, 2 Reform, 1 Conservative, 1 Chabad. And none of them are open to housing the homeless. So what is Family Promise? And what will it look like at TKE for just 1 week? Just 1 week this coming year. What it looks like is that we'll house 4 homeless families at the Doc and Rita Lebow Center. Most homeless shelters separate children from their parents. Family Promise at TKE will enable us to keep homeless families together. Homeless families will check in each night. They'll be fed a hot meal, given a warm, safe space to put their children to bed and to settle down for the night. So how can you help? And what can we do? We need volunteers to help check guests in. Volunteers to prepare and to serve hot meals. Volunteers to sleep over and to serve as manager of the Doc and Rita Lebow Center that night. The people that we will house at TKE Family Promise, they are the working poor. They are not the mentally ill or the drug addicted. Those populations, too, deserve a safe place to stay. but they are not our mandate. Family Promise provides outreach to families that have jobs, but because of temporary reversals, they cannot afford permanent housing. We will need volunteers to help our guests find more permanent apartments or homes, to help them search for jobs, to help to move them in once a more permanent home is found. Family Promise, like the other great program that we're involved with, like Habitat for Humanity, Family Promise is more than a hand out, it is a hand up. Formulated to help move the working poor from homelessness to having homes or apartments on their own. So now, as I come almost to my end, let me share with you a very famous Jewish story about how the very first Jewish temple was ever founded. Long ago on the site of Jerusalem, the holy city, there lived two brothers. The city of Jerusalem is actually on top of a hill, and the two brothers were farmers who tilled the land, each on his own side of the hill. The older brother was unmarried. He lived alone. On the other side of the mountain, the younger brother was married. He had 4 children. The day after Yom Kippur, the week of Sukkot, that's the beginning of the harvest festival. So the day after Yom Kippur, the night that the harvest began, the older brother couldn't sleep. I have no children to feed, reasoned the older brother. My younger brother needs more harvest than I do. Perhaps at midnight, I will climb the hill. I will descend in the darkness. I'll find my brother's farm. I'll deliver some extra grain to him for his children, and none's the wiser. However, that very same night, the younger brother couldn't sleep either. My older brother has no children, said that brother, and no one to help him with his harvest. So maybe at midnight, I'll sneak over the hill. I will find my brother's farm, and I will deliver him some extra grain to help him in his old age. The following morning, the brothers awoke, each in their own house. They discovered that miraculously they had each had a deposit of grain in the middle of the night. Even so, the very next night, the brothers repeated the action, each one secretly delivering grain to the other brother's farm. Each morning, the brothers arose, and behold, there was more grain than before. Well, finally, and so it happened on the third night, while each brother was carrying his surplus grain to the brother, it was deep darkness that night. And in the darkness, the brothers, they bumped into each other. And it was then at last that they figured out what must have been happening the previous nights. They dropped their grain. They cried and they embraced, weeping with gratitude and happiness that they had each provided for the other the opportunity of the mitzvah of feeding the hungry. That's the story, but the punchline of the story comes later. The punchline says the Jewish teaching is that God saw what happened that night that two brothers bumped into each other, the exact spot where two brothers had met. And the story goes, God blessed that exact spot where one brother had recognized the other. And so in the course of time, years later, when King Solomon built the very first Jewish temple in Jerusalem, the temple, the place from which peace and love would flow out to the entire world, it was on that spot, the spot where the brothers recognized each other. It was on that spot where the original temple was constructed. And so, my deepest friends, I ask you now, do you know who your brother is? Dr. King wrote, I sought my soul, but my soul I could not see. I sought my God, but he eluded me. And then, at last, I sought my brother, and then I found all three. And so I bless all of you here today. I bless you, I bless your children, and I bless your elders. I pray, may it be a year of life, a year of peace, a year of health. May this year be the year when we recognize that the person standing right in front of us, well, that person, in fact, is our very own brother. And let us all say,